Hello, and thank you everybody for joining us at Driven 2021. Welcome to today's episode featuring an expert RPA roundtable. Before I hand things off to Krista, I want to encourage you to use our chat feature to ask any questions that may arise during the interview. And at the end of today's interview, please join us in our expert roundtable as we answer questions live in the chat. Also in the chat, I've placed a link to register for the live raffle of Beats EarPods today. It's important that you use your work email when registering for the raffle, as we must comply with corporate and government guidelines. With that, I'm going to go ahead and pass things off to Krista.
Thanks, Julia. So thank you guys for joining us today. Today we have a group of RPA experts, some of the top leaders, I think, in the RPA field in general. And I'm going to let each of them introduce themselves. So why don't, Sarah, we start with you ladies first.
Hi, I'm Sarah Hansen. I'm an RPA practice lead here at BP3. I've been doing RPA for about 5 years now. So I've seen a lot of stuff.
Matt, why don't you go next?
Yeah, my name is Matt Newell, and I am an automation architect here at BP3, and I've actually been working with RPA for about the past 5 years as well.
And Shravan?
Yep, so I'm Shravan Singh. So I'm in RPA space for last, I think, 4 years. Before that, we were working with other process automation tools.
And Shravan, you're actually wearing your Driven 2021 t-shirt today, showing off the swag that you can get if you register for Driven. Okay, well, let's get started by talking about actually getting started. So when someone decides to automate with RPA, Shravan, where do you suggest people actually start? Where should they start looking?
Yeah, I would suggest to start with a small POC or a use case which is low complexity and high value. Because many times business don't know what RPA can do, what it can't do. And then the other thing I would suggest is to demo that to various departments. Like if you are, although you're building for finance, but do the demo for marketing, procurement, other departments too, so they can see what RPA can do. And then it starts the ball rolling and they can think what other use cases they can add.
That's great advice. And it's actually something that came up in last week's Driven episode with Jacob over from the CEO of Kamunda, who talked about like targeting things that actually have relevance to the business but aren't super complex. So Matt, when you start with things that are relevant to the business but not too complex, how do you do process discovery? Like, you know, I'm from the old school BPM days where we would sit down with the stakeholders and do the process discovery. Is that the same with RPA?
It is. Typically, what I've done it's been relatively old school, where you just kind of sit down and whiteboard some ideas. Shravan touched on finance, human resources is another area that I've worked at, where it's, you know, relatively, there's going to be a pretty deep well of processes that can be automated. You know, invoice data, for example, like there's really only so many ways that you can pay for an invoice. So that's something that's fairly replicable. That's a pretty good opportunity that I've seen, and just kind of draw it out, what the intentions are, kind of a roadmap to an extent. Yeah.
I'll say, you know, Shravan touched on showing demos. Those are so important because it gets the wheels turning. Maybe you don't know where to start. Maybe you don't know if you have processes appropriate or not. But once, you know, once someone has a POC and they demo it, that's what really gets people thinking. There's also a lot of great documentation out there about what types of processes make good RPA use cases. So I would say it's important to look that up and see if you have processes that are good fits, and if they're not, maybe put effort into, you know, making them appropriate for RPA.
Yeah, and other thing I would add to that is, so when you're doing a process discovery, unless some user doesn't want to be recorded, I would say record how they do the process currently, step by step, because unless we are doing the process reengineering, we want to replicate what the user does through bot. I mean, we can replace some UI automation with API calls and all those things, that we can decide when we do the design for that. But in order for the architect or the developer to see how it is currently run in a manual mode is very helpful. And they need not to go all the time to business, because sometimes business are so busy that they can't give so much time. So it's better to refer back to the video and go from there.
It helps to target like an existing process. You know, you don't want to get too excited and start thinking about optimizing and automating like at the same time. Like start with an existing process that users currently do that can answer all the questions and ins and outs, and just automate, start there, and then optimize later maybe.
So you already answered my next question, because a lot of times when we were doing old BPM projects, you'd go in, you'd say, this is how you're currently doing it, but with BPM, you could cut out like these steps. Do you find that that's the same thing you do with RPA?
Yeah, we face similar issues, and you really kind of have to handle it on a case by case basis, right? You set yourself up for success when you automate processes that are highly standardized, predictable. You know most of the exceptions. If you start trying to go into things like, well, let's have the bot do it this way, but no one's ever done it that way, that can slow you down a little bit. But it's not impossible. It just might slow things down.
So Matt, I'll come back to you. So you've discovered your first project, you've implemented it, we've got some success rolling. What are your best practices for going to that second project and that third project and really building a pipeline for automation and what you're going to automate?
From my experience, a lot of it is considering a lot of options to fill the pipeline and not necessarily being exclusionary. Earlier, we touched on kind of doing a roadshow and showing people examples, and that can certainly get people excited and start to think about how their job could be improved with automation. You know, if a portion of their job is to, you know, help desk, for example, if you're trying to help people troubleshoot issues, but 2 hours of your job is fulfilling orders for devices or something, that's a piece that can be moved to automation to allow them to focus on the higher level work that they're doing to help those users, for example. So that is something that can really build momentum, not being exclusionary, like I mentioned, and from an organizational perspective, kind of bring it about and say, this is important. This is something which is going to have lasting benefits across the organization. So it's not just growing in specific pockets. It's taking that approach from an organizational perspective.
Yeah, and other one thing I add to that is typically when you have evangelized your automation to some departments and you have 2 or 3 processes that are running in production, then we typically create a bot intake form that typically will have a summary of the process, how much time it takes to manually do it. Are there steps which are mostly repeatable and they can be automated with simple rules? Those type of things we collect from each department, from whatever the automation they think they want to create, and then build an Excel or something like that, which have all the list of those 20, 30, 50, whatever automations we want to build in future. And then we prioritize based on feasibility, complexity, ROI, and all those things.
So Shravan, to that point, how do I know that I should be putting what I do on a daily basis into these automation intake forms? For example, like I come to my job, I do my job, and it just doesn't dawn on me that like a bot could be doing that job. What do you suggest? Like, what do you tell people? Here's things that you should look at to say, these are things that I should automate.
Yeah, so when we want them to fill an bot intake form, so first thing is they just put a simple summary. So they can put that. And then they have to look out for all the repeatable things that they do in and out every day. And I mean, you can easily feel when we are doing those things that they are so boring that you don't want to do that. So we want to extract those out of your bucket, and bot is a great fit for that. We can automate that, and then you can focus on your high value task, and that's how you fill that form.
Right. And to touch on that, what Shravan was saying, like, yeah, things that are frustrating that don't require your brain. I'm sure we've all had jobs where we're like, wow, a monkey could do this, or what am I even doing here? Or, I'd rather get to this other work. I worked with a client and they had a process, and it was a monthly thing they needed to do, very manual, like a swivel chair. And they had someone on a totally different team performing this process. Like, it wasn't even her actual job. They just needed someone else to do it. So yeah, those kinds of things you don't want to do. Don't take your brain. Don't have a lot of like exception paths, things like that.
I think, Shravan, I love the mind-numbing things that you don't want to do. There are a lot of things in my job that I don't want to do, but I don't think we can automate most of it.
Well, we might. Well, there's, you could automate parts of things.
Yeah, absolutely.
You don't have to automate the whole entire thing. Maybe there's just the tail end of the process, or the front end, or something in between. So maybe make it slightly less mind-numbing.
So that's why the pattern so that's why the pattern has shifted from it is replacing your job to it's like a digital assistant for you. So it will take out the job that you don't want to do. If you had an assistant, you would delegate that to that person. Now you can think from that perspective. Now you have a bot. Can we delegate that to the bot?
I love that. So getting back into some of the questions, what are some things that you guys have seen? I guess we're on this channel, we gossip a lot, but what are some things that you've seen at clients that you took a step back and said, oh, that really works really well. I'm going to take that to another client. Does anybody have a case that they've seen that?
Yeah, I've seen that multiple times. One of the great thing I have seen with one of the clients is that typically when we move from one environment to other, people export the file, log into other environment, import that, then they move to production by exporting, importing. They've automated the whole pipeline. So they were using the Jenkins jobs to do that. As soon as your bot is ready to move to QA, you go to that pipeline, you select what bot you need to deploy. Then before deploying to QA, it has to be approved in ServiceNow. So there was an integration with ServiceNow, where if that request number is not approved, you can't deploy that to QA or to prod. So that was a great feature they had. And in addition to that, they also had statistical analysis or static analysis on the bot, whether it is following the best practices, like number of lines in a code, the naming pattern you use. So those type of things were very useful that we typically don't see when we develop automation anywhere or any RPA bots.
I love DevOps pipelines coming up in the RPA talk. So Matt, anything that you've seen that you've taken from one customer to another?
Yeah, mine is a little bit more like how to get things done from an interpersonal level. One client that I had a dedicated IT individual that basically we could go to. They were our point person, and they had they weren't like a senior director or anything. They just had a lot of contacts throughout the IT organization, where if we didn't, a lot of times what happens is you submit a ticket and maybe you didn't submit it right, you get bounced back, you kind of move around. This individual is a really strong guiding hand to say, yes, you want to submit it here, it should go here. So kind of allowing us to be more efficient in that way in order to get things done kind of on the back end to an extent.
Finding a faster way to do that, if you will.
No, there you go.
Sarah, what about you?
This is kind of similar to what Matt was saying. It's really important, and it's really refreshing when clients have those champions, like those point people who have, the power to say, like, to push things through, to prevent things from getting blocked, and make sure everything runs smoothly. bots and some of the software, it doesn't really fit neatly into an IT box or development. Like it can be tricky for organizations to know how to put everything together and who they need to pull in. But as long as you have like one or two champions leading, they can get those people together. We can solve all those tricky problems, those tricky IT problems together. So yeah, it's really nice when we have those clients.
So in the same vein then, Sarah, what are some things that you've seen that are really bad at some clients that you're like, I definitely need to stop this at my next client?
Not having those champions. So sometimes they, not having them, and just, it just slows things down. I don't know who to contact, or I'll try to contact someone and they don't get back to me. Another, slightly different thing is, we need to think about if you want us to automate something for you, you need to realize that you need to give us access to those applications directly. And you need to give access to robot users as well. Oftentimes we'll see we'll do discovery, we'll see the process, and we're like, great, this is great use case. But then when we need to access, we're like, okay, we're ready to develop, or we're ready to go to production, access just takes so long and it blocks so much progress. So those things need to be thought of ahead of time. Like, okay, how are we going to get these users access? Who do we need to talk to? And then, for a robot user, again, doesn't really fit nicely into a box, into anybody's like IT or security protocols. Need to think of those ahead of time.
What about you, Shravan? Things that you will make sure aren't repeated at customers? A different client.
So one of the thing I've seen, because RPA is marketed as low code thing, so people think that you can get away with bad code. So I've seen bots with 1,000 and 1,500 lines, and although it might have taken 4 weeks or 6 weeks to develop that, but to maintain that is a nightmare. So people don't think from that perspective when developing bots that it has to follow all the software development best practices. Either it's a dry approach, to not repeat anything, or modular code, reusable code, all those things. And then the other part is security. Like Sarah mentioned, one side of security that you need to have access, but I would say you need to have the access that bot needs to do its work, not more than that. Sometimes I've seen people give all the access to the bot, and then there are some things that happen security wise that we want to avoid. So we need to know what access you are giving to bot, and it should have the required access, but it should not have more access than that.
Those evil marketing people just telling lies all right and left. That's what they're here for. Matt, what about you?
Mine's going to go a little bit more to the technical side. Just improper error handling, and not, I had a client where we went in and kind of did a health check on what they had. And if there was an error that was occurring, there was no visibility. There wasn't any reporting to the business users if something had to be done manually. So it's steps like those, which are kind of base level. From my perspective, you definitely want to have as much transparency to the business, because ultimately they're the ones that are responsible for this process to be done. So reporting, saying, hey, I couldn't log in and this is probably the reason, kind of narrowing it down. You don't want to necessarily put yourself into a box and trying to, kind of like what Sarah said, account for all of these exceptions, because it could be 1,000,001 potentially, but it's having something to hinge on. Either this went right, so I'm going to proceed, or this went wrong, so I'm going to kind of back out, have that contingency plan, and let somebody know that there may be a manual step involved, and we can work through that.
And I would add one thing to that in exception handling. Like people who build bots, they think that if it works fine 5 or 10 times, it works fine 1,000 times. But that's not how bot work, right? Because bot is as strong as its weakest link, because when people work on a website, they can find workaround to do the same thing, and bot can't do that. It has to be coded exactly how you want bot to work. So if there is a website that if you click on something, page freezes and you don't have a retry mechanism to come out of it, your bot will fail. So people build for happy paths, but I would say here we need to keep an eye on exception paths more than typically what we see in typical development, because bot will fail and then it can't recover unless you code it for it.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's especially a problem in unattended robots too. You know, as you said, Shravan, people are thinking a happy path. When someone starts telling me about a process, I am thinking about everything that can go wrong. And if it goes wrong here, what do I need to undo? Or what's the most useful thing to give to the user? Because we want it to fail gracefully. Your bots are going to fail sometimes. That's okay. We're going to make them fail in a really good way that doesn't cause catastrophic problems and that are, you know, as Matt was saying, provide full transparency and let the users know, okay, it failed. What do I need to do? And be very clear about that.
As Buzz Lightyear would say, falling with style.
Yes.
Failing gracefully there.
Mm-hmm.
Falling in style, and I would say be anti-fragile, so you get up also and get going.
All right, so let's switch gears a little bit. Let's talk about the intersection of AI and RPA. This is a big topic. We've seen other videos on this channel about it. So subscribe to our channel if you want to hear about the intersection even more, because in our next Driven in December, we're going to be talking about intelligent document processing. So let's talk about where you guys see the best examples of RPA meeting AI.
So I have an example from a bot that we created in Automation Anywhere. It was like a real estate related kind of process. Long story short, at some point, these new accounts would come in and they would need to be categorized. So there were established categories, and then there were like, you know, accounts, it was just text that needed to be categorized properly. So we had our AI wizard, Tom Wilger, create a decision service for us. So the bot, when it got to that point where it was time to categorize, it would just make a REST API call to that decision service, and the decision service would come back and return what it thought the category was with its confidence level. So we trained it, you know, created a nice model, and it, you know, the bot would populate, you know, the category, but it would also give a user a chance to go through and correct, so that we had the ability to kind of like send that information back and retrain the model if needed. So that was amazing. I love when we can give our bots some brains. Our PA bots don't have brains, they can't think, but sometimes we can give them brains.
I love the concept of this being filmed right after Halloween. So we're talking about, you know, giving brains, not eating brains. So Matt, where do you see the intersection of RPA and AI working the best?
From what I've seen, the most advanced example of AI is Google Vision, and the fact that it can read handwriting. That is absolutely mind-blowing to me. I saw it like 2 years ago, and it's still amazing. And using those API calls to potentially send that data and say, you know, what is this? Let's get this response back so we can move forward.
Yeah. Gordon Siegfried wrote an article on our support site about the OCR engines that are compatible with UiPath. And I think OCR in general is a really big topic, especially when it comes to RPA and handling of mundane tasks, if you will.
Yeah.
So Shravan, do you have anything to add where you see the intersection of RPA and AI?
Yeah, I mean, especially with COVID last year, we were working with a client. There were like thousands of unemployment claims, and they have very limited staff to process those. So we built a system for them that they can send, because people used to send their W-2s, their identity documents and all those things. So we built a pipeline where the pipeline used to first classify those documents in separate categories, and then we use IQ bot to create learning instances. So we were feeding those documents to those IQ bot learning instances to get the structured data out of that, and then we were using that to feed into the systems where those unemployment claims were processed. So, I mean, this is the best example of RPA meeting AI and solving the real pain that we had last year with COVID unemployment.
Yeah, that's a really good example. Thank you. All right, guys. So just to end this conversation, we're going to end it on a high note. We're going to pretend like I'm your new client, right? And we've just met, and you're going to give me your best piece of advice for starting an RPA program, or your best piece of advice for RPA in general. So what would you say? Matt, I'm going to make you go first.
Okay.
No pressure, just don't mess it up.
Yeah, no, I completely understand. I think the biggest thing, especially when working with a new client in particular, is honestly setting realistic expectations, kind of summarizing what we just discussed here in a lot of circumstances, and saying, this process is going to be built to the best of our ability. We're going to need support from the business. We're going to need documentation. We're going to need a good quality SME. And, just the fact that there may be situations where a server's down, where an application had changed. It's not the end of the world. That's something that we can, fix. And it's using all of the support system to kind of mitigate those risks as much as possible, but with the understanding that, it's not necessarily going to be blue sky at every step of the way, because I think, not to touch on like sales and marketing again, but I think that could kind of get lost in some circumstances, and just setting those expectations in the delivery realm.
It's okay, Matt. I like that you threw the sales people on yourself
first.
Robin just went straight for marketing, but I think sales people is where we really get it,
We're making enemies everywhere. Yeah.
What about you, Robin? What would you say is your best piece of advice?
I would say I'll not tell you anything, just engage us for a few days and I'll show you a demo, and then it will show you the value that we can deliver.
Well, all right. Well, Sarah, I'm not sure how you're going to follow that up, but I completely agree with that one.
Yeah, no, that's great. I would just say start small. As Matt was saying, make sure your expectations are set properly and get as many stakeholders involved as you can. You're going to need buy-in from IT and security folks and like enablement and like the business users. Like make sure everybody is kind of communicating and they're on the same page. That way you can solve problems together and move forward.
And I would add to that is, don't see COE as an afterthought. So whenever you start building bot, start with best practices in mind, because if you don't do that, it will come back and haunt you.
Yeah, the long game, planning with the intent that this is eventually going to be business as usual. It's not going to be anything, to fear basically in the organization. It's, we can get a bot to do that and it'll do it in, X amount of time and it'll be great.
Thank you so much, Sarah, Shravan, and Matt, for sitting down and sharing this great information with us today. Viewers, please stay tuned as we transition into the live Q&A portion, and be on the lookout for the link in the chat to enter for our Beats Noise Canceling Earphone raffle. Due to the nature of the raffle, you must register with your work email to be included. Now let's go live. It feels weird to thank myself, but thank you, Krista from the past, for handing that off to us so seamlessly. We have a ton of questions coming into the chat, so I'm going to dive right in. And I'm going to kind of let you guys break it up and let me know who wants to answer what. So I guess we'll start. Do you have any tips on how to make sure there's a good foundation to start building RPA on? I don't know if this is more like a technical setup but answer it how you please.
Yeah, as I mentioned in the last video that you just played, that don't think COE as an afterthought. So right from the get-go, after you had done your POC and you decided to move forward, start building a COE so that it can build best practices. It can build bot templates for you. You have standard TDD, a process design document, other bot templates that you need, so that in future it doesn't come and haunt you. So you have all the reusable code. You are using all the best practices that we use for any software development. Those definitely you would need as a foundation.
Yeah, I would say keep scalability in mind. When we start small, or at the beginning, you might say, yeah, we only need one robot for this, but you need to keep in mind we are going to need to set up more robots. Our process volume might increase. We're going to need to expand. So, it might be overkill at the beginning to like build things that are like going to be super scalable, but it's going to like really save you in the long run.
Yeah. My thought is it's kind of combining both of those, understanding from the get-go kind of where you want to go inevitably. Initially, or do you believe your organization is going to be consistently more centralized for a COE? Is it going to be more federated? Because kind of planning that out, building out who's responsible for what, if it is a federated team, is it going to be a hub and spoke model? Understanding all of those different pieces in an organization, because an organization is going to have, be able to have the IT piece, the business piece, the center of excellence piece, and it's combining all of those puzzle pieces and having a long-term vision, I guess, is kind of the recommendation that I would give.
I think it's a good recommendation, often hard to implement, but a good recommendation. So, okay, do you guys have any tips or suggestions for figuring out, and this is a little bit of a controversial subject, but which RPA tool to use?
I would say you really need to start by downloading the community editions. Like there are free editions for a lot of them. Like the good thing is that they're all kind of very competitive, which is good for us because that means kind of their features are very similar. So no matter what you go with, like you're going to more or less be able to accomplish the same things. So then it might come down to personal preference. So definitely like get hands-on, read the available documentation, create POCs.
Yes, I mean, one of the easier ways to pick some of the reports, like famous reports like Gartner report or Forrester report, and do look at Magic Quadrant, but do look at the details around those so that you can match your context with what those tools can deliver and then decide based on that. And that's a decision on today, but you also need to think what you will need down the line in a couple of years. If they can share the roadmap they have for next couple of years, that may be a good data point for you to decide if that matches what your needs will be in future. So that's another way to decide on the tool you want to use.
And I would say network as well. Talk to people who might be in your peer group who are using some of these tools and get their firsthand experience as well. So it kind of takes the bias out of it too.
I like that.
Yeah.
All right. So the next question is, how do you go about determining if a process is actually worth automating? Matt, I'm going to make you start. Hot seat.
To me, it's worth is kind of a loaded word. It's understanding what the business goals are, how it ties in with organizational goals. It's not necessarily always hard ROI dollars, but that is a compelling argument. If for your business customer experience is highly valued, then does this particular process hit that customer experience goal? If associate experience is highly valued, does it hit that goal? So it's kind of prioritizing based on what your organization's values are, and every organization isn't besides hard ROI dollars, like, this is going to take 2 hours off of these 50 people who are doing this work so they can do some higher level stuff. Like that's easy to quantify. But just take it into consideration some of the I guess softer considerations too.
Yeah.
So just to add on to that question, Shravan, sorry to interrupt, but have you guys seen from the start of the pandemic in April or March, January 2020, let's call it, to now, have you seen those priorities of automation shift and how people figure out what to automate? Like, I'm thinking like, I want to make sure that people don't have to be in the office, for example, or that, hiring up or scaling up for the holiday season for like UPS, for example, it needs to be more automated. Have you guys seen the shift in clients' thought processes around that?
Yeah. So there was one client I was working with because they shifted to working from home. Like prior to that, they had a highly manual process that dealt with actual pieces of mail, like snail mail, right? And so they needed help. Like, okay, now we want to scan the documents. We want the bot to help us process some of this stuff. So definitely, like, priorities are changing. Due to the change in the work culture and the pandemic and everything. And they needed a lot of help, like, just handling that volume, handling the awkwardness of scanning in mail. Of course, we weren't able to automate that whole thing, but we were able to automate some pieces later on that really provided value for them.
Yeah, that's, I guess, we already plugged intelligent document processing on the next Driven. We'll plug it again there. That's mailroom automation, all about intelligent document processing. Shravan, you were going to say something about how to figure out how to determine the best process for automating.
Yeah, as Matt has said that, how you decide how to choose. So if I add to that is you have to make sure the process you are automating is stable. So if you automate it, it changes down the line and it changes every week, then it's just a waste of your time. Either you re-engineer that in a way so it becomes stable, or you just wait it out that automatically it gets stable. And you are automating with different system, you also need to make sure if it's internal system, external, how often it changes. Because if it's an internal, you can have meeting with the folks there to plan your automations. Like if there is a change that's needed, you can sit with them to decide that. But if it's an external website, you don't have a lot of control. So you need a way to do the automation. So in order to do that, either if there is a possibility, don't use UI automation, go with API automations if possible. That will help you to mitigate that risk. So I would say the stability of the process, how the different system you're interacting with changes, those can be the additional parameter you need to think of when automating a process.
Yeah, I know that's a really good point, especially about those external sites that are changing. I know there's one client that uses our support offering just to make sure that when those government websites that they're using change, state government websites change, our support team makes sure it goes in, re-automates, and because you don't necessarily need a whole new bot, but maybe the field moved, or the button moved, which is a big deal. Okay, so the next question is, let's say we did our POC and we're super excited about RPA, but now we want to automate every task possible. How do we help lead the conversation towards better RPA candidates?
Yes, prioritization is a keyword. And unless you prioritize, some programs I've seen are a failure because they prioritize it wrong and then they blame that RPA doesn't work. No, RPA works, but you have to do it the right way. So priority is the main thing, and priority will be dependent on your goals. And then RPA is one of the tool in your digital transformation strategy. So you have to think holistically. If you see a use case, it may not fit RPA, but it can fit some other tools. So you have to keep that in mind, I would say.
Yeah, I asked this last week in episode 5 with our design team. How do we make sure that people remember their goals? Like, I know I'm guilty of this at work in general, that says, hey, I'm, this is my goal, but then right now I have to do all this mundane shit to eventually reach that goal. How do you guys, when you're implementing RPA, make sure that people remember that goal so that you have the right priority? Matt, do you have tips and tricks?
Yeah. I actually just finished up an engagement with a care organization, stated up their COE, where we discuss things like having a priority matrix, having, like Shravan touched on last week, having an intake form, and having review sessions for processes, and saying it's, out of 5, the business says this process is a 5 for associate experience, it's a 5 for, so it's having a matrix that has a component that can continuously tie back to those organizational goals. And one thing to keep in mind too is if the organizational goals change, then there's no reason why that can't necessarily be adjusted. It's the status right now is X, Y, and Z, but it could potentially evolve. So I think that's crucial to kind of keep in mind where you're going, because like you said, it can easily get lost.
Okay, so the next question is, when we're working with BP3, how long does it generally take to automate processes in RPA? Wow.
Yeah.
A lot of variables.
That's
Easy question, right? Like, this is very easy. You guys can say it takes 2 to 3 weeks. Or...
Yes, I mean, one approach is to segregate them based on complexity, like how many systems integrate, how many steps it has, all those things. Probably you can segregate small, medium, and large type of process. And if you are starting with POC should take a few days, and then small process can take maybe 2 weeks to develop, few days of UAT, and then production in hypercare. And then medium process can take around maybe 3 to 4 weeks. The large process can be 4 to 6 or more. But even if you are building a large process, I would say be agile. So I prefer agile automation approach. So if suppose you have a large process that in theory will take 6 weeks, so I would say develop for 2 weeks, deploy whatever steps. Suppose it has 12 steps or 15 steps, develop 5 steps and move it to UAT and production. And then plug in the new steps to that. So you need to make architecture in such a way so that you can plug in steps to that. So in a way you can see the ROI quickly, and it will also help business to not to do those 5 tasks which are already in production. They can focus on rest 7 steps if they are 12. And then as soon as you automate more, you add to that architecture so that it finally reaches the whole goal. So don't make agile waterfall, I will say, keep agile.
Yeah, I would say, from a high level, we can provide these estimations, as Shravan was saying, like if it's something relatively small, this many weeks, medium or large, what have you. But what you also need to keep in mind, though, is like, as we said in our video last week, like the access, like I'm like, yeah, it'll only take me 4 weeks to develop this. But if I'm waiting 1 to 2 or more weeks to even get my environment, to get access to all the applications, like that's going to add to your like dev time. So, just got to be really flexible, got to be agile, got to be ready for surprises.
Yeah, I'm going to plug
for those, I would say, as soon as you start designing, so when you have your process design or technical design ready for review, at that time you'll know what accesses you need. Start those requests right there, so that when bot starts to move to another environment like UAT or other, you don't see any issues. Obviously for development, if you need access, that still has to be done, otherwise you can't develop. But typically these issues come more in the other environment. So if we can start early, assuming that it will take time, that can mitigate this problem a little bit.
Yeah, and I'll plug that Sarah actually wrote a blog about on time and on budget delivery of RPA last week. I think it went live November 8th. So you should go to the BP3 blog and read that, because she points to some really good documentation to help you actually deliver on time and on budget. And it was essentially those points. So, okay, next question is, all technologies have limitations. What are the biggest and most surprising limitations you've discovered within RPA?
So, sorry, In particular, like bots that are intended to be kicked off like in an ad hoc or like an as needed basis can be a little bit awkward if you're just using pure RPA. Like for example, like an example would be a user preparing one or more files, and then could be happen at any time. That's not too hard because we can designate a folder for users to drop the files in, and then a bot to pick them up from there. Like that's not too bad. But then I also have another process, another bot I developed that is kicked off via email. Like users will send email to the robot inbox. At first, that was a little awkward. There are limitations because they're very sensitive to like typos, things like that. So at first, it was awkward, a lot of mistakes. But as users got more used to it, like it got better. But it still like leaves a little to be desired. So that's one area that I'm like, users kicking off bots can be a little bit, a little awkward. Take some time to get used to.
Yeah.
One area that kind of piggybacking on what Sarah said, free text boxes tend to be because they're user generated, and typos, and a situation. I had a client that I was working with, and they were entering all of this text into a SharePoint submission form, and it was all free text. And it was, initially they were saying, it'll be fine. There's rarely any spelling errors, which how can you really quantify that is part of my question. But, it soon became apparent that it's like, no, we need drop downs because, we can do our best. We can use fuzzy logic to kind of infer what might be maybe they're saying, but assumptions really shouldn't be made in this scenario. When we can define these are your only selections. So situations like that. Also, it's not that it's a hard stop, but something on the previous interview session that we touched on were like machine learning and OCR technologies. Those aren't hard steps. Those are ways that we can work within the bounds of the automation application, and things like external components like decision engines, or like any of the other OCR engines that maybe don't come inherent with the tool, but you can still tie into. Those, like I said, they're not hard stops. They're areas that we can continue to move forward. So it's not a limitation. It's just like a slight mark.
That's why I see RPA as like a spectrum. Like any limitation which is a limitation like 5 years back, I would say rethink about it, because things are changing so fast. So like a simple example of unstructured data, if you go 5 years back, it's nearly impossible or very difficult to get the data in structured form. But with Google, Microsoft using state-of-art ways to get the data from PDF through OCR, it's constantly evolving. Mm-hmm. Now, the bots we build and which uses OCR technologies or which converts the unstructured data to structured data has become better. I would say much better, and things are evolving. So any limitation that you see today, I would say rethink in 6 months again, those use cases, take a look that has any technology come that can help us to automate those use cases.
I love how fast things change, and also don't love how fast things change. But all right, I'm going to give a quick pause and say last chance to register for the Beats Earbud raffle. And we have 2 more questions, and we'll go through them relatively quickly because we're running out of time here. But when someone wants to build RPA for the first time, do they usually know? So do they usually know what they need, or do you find yourselves really being the Sherpas? Do you find yourselves being the guides?
I would say, again, it depends on the client and their processes. Sometimes they'll come in and say, we have these 3 processes. We want to automate these with RPA. And sometimes they are appropriate. Sometimes we have to go back and say, this one may not be so great. We can do part of this, or let's try to find something else. Other times, they might not have a good idea. And we have to be, a little bit more involved in discovery and guide them. Either way, we're guiding them, but it really depends.
Okay,
Yeah.
we'll do a quick follow-up question on that because that's the last question. So what discovery work usually needs to be done or done better before the actual implementation of a bot?
I was gonna let you go, Matt, if you had something, but I can.
Yeah, no, I was thinking, I've mentioned documentation in the past, and that's a big component of the discovery. You can, previously Shravan touched on going through and having a recording of a process, and that's worth its weight in gold, but also having consistent documentation that we can point out and say, no, this is standardized, because here's the standard way that it's being done. And we can go back to that and kind of marry that up with the video and get an understanding from there.
Yes.
Yeah, and it might not, it sounds obvious, but we need to sit with the actual users who perform the process. Sometimes I've been in a situation where they're like, okay, here you go, here's the steps, and it's coming from maybe leads or people who don't touch the process directly. We need to sit with those users, and as many as we can, as many as we can, the better, because sometimes users will have slightly different variations, and we need to figure out what is the best way for the bot to do it.
Yeah, I agree with that. And so sometimes when user is recording, they will directly go to the place where they do the work. They don't go from the start, or they go to website, they provide username, password, they click on this link to reach a particular place. They start from directly there. So it's difficult when we are coding how they reach there, because bot needs to know all the steps that they did to reach there. And other thing is, whenever they are recording, we also ask if you can do voiceover, oh, and I am logging in, I'm providing user. I mean, it feels odd to them. It's very difficult for them to do that, but if they do that, that helps us. If we are not with them on that recording, that helps a lot.
Also, I think that kind of helps them slow down a little bit and think about specifically the actions that they're doing and why, and that will kind of come out a little bit and helps us on the development side too.
It's also important to keep in mind that even with the best recording or the best discovery session, it's not necessarily possible to get every single detail we need up front. Once we start developing and doing the process on our own, more questions are going to come up. So there might be more discovery sessions. So it's important that the SMEs have a little bit of time to dedicate or are available for us to continually ask questions and continually work together and stay.
Especially from the recording, what misses is exception. So if anything will go wrong, that you have to think through when you're developing the bot or when you are doing the discovery session with them, so that you can ask question. Oh, if the file that comes doesn't have this field, what happens? Oh, then I call someone to do that. Oh, then that's a totally different use case. So we have to see how to mitigate that by asking them to fill an Excel with pre-populated data so that bot can work end to end without human intervention.
Well, I'm not going to cut you guys off, but we are running out of time here. So I'm going to say thank you, Sarah, Shravan, and Matt, for joining us today. And thank you, viewers, for joining us on episode 6 of Driven 2021. I cannot believe it. Our random selection raffle has selected Jason Patcher, sorry if I ruined your name there, as the winner of the Beats earpods this week. Congratulations, and we will be reaching out to you shortly. Our next episode is 3 weeks from today. It is Tuesday, December 7th, and it'll be with BP3's Intelligent Document Processing Wizard, Tom Wilger, again at 11 a.m. Eastern Time. This exciting overview will tell you what, how, and when to use intelligent document processing. You won't want to miss it. And you don't want to miss out on the conference t-shirt sent directly to your door. Registration for the t-shirt is closing soon. So make sure to go to the Driven registration. You can find it on the BP3 website. And we look forward to seeing you right here in 3 weeks, and have a very happy Thanksgiving to everyone who celebrates.